Dr. Marcus Chen had seen thousands of patients walk through the doors of Seattle General Hospital's emergency department, but something about the young woman sitting in the corner caught his attention. She wasn't making a scene like most people who came in during the night shift. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at the floor with an intensity that made him pause. Her name was Emma Rodriguez, according to the chart. 24 years old, brought in by a concerned roommate who reported she hadn't eaten in 3 days and had been talking to herself. The roommate had left after filling out the paperwork, muttering something about not being able to handle this anymore. Marcus approached slowly, the way he'd learned to do with patients who seemed fragile. Emma's dark hair fell like a curtain around her face, and when she finally looked up at him, her eyes held a sharpness that surprised him. They weren't the vacant, unfocused eyes he often saw in cases of severe mental health episodes. These eyes were calculating, almost predatory in their intelligence. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm Dr. Chen. Can you tell me how you're feeling today?" he asked, pulling up a chair to sit at her level rather than towering over her. Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The patterns are everywhere, in the ceiling tiles, in the way people walk, in the numbers on your badge." She pointed at his hospital ID, which displayed his employee number, 44729. "That's not random." "Nothing is random." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. This sounded like the beginning of a psychotic episode, possibly schizophrenia. The pattern-seeking behavior, the paranoid undertones, the social withdrawal her roommate had described. He made a mental note to order a full psychiatric evaluation. "What kind of patterns are you seeing, Emma?" he asked gently, trying to keep her talking while he assessed her mental state. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Nobody ever believes the quiet ones. We're supposed to stay invisible, stay in the background. But sometimes staying in the background means you see things others miss." Over the next hour, Marcus listened as Emma described elaborate conspiracy theories involving her workplace, a large tech company downtown. She spoke about her boss, someone she called the CEO, and how she'd noticed irregularities in the company's financial reports. Her speech was rapid and disorganized, jumping from topic to topic in a way that confirmed his growing suspicions about her mental state. "I tried to tell someone," Emma said, her voice growing more agitated, "but I'm just the girl who makes copies and organizes files. Nobody listens to the shy girl who barely speaks up in meetings. So I started documenting everything myself. Every discrepancy, every suspicious transaction, every meeting that happened behind closed doors." Marcus nodded sympathetically while making notes. Delusions of grandeur mixed with paranoia were classic symptoms. The belief that she, a low-level employee, had uncovered some major conspiracy was textbook. He'd seen it before in patients who felt powerless in their real lives and created elaborate fantasies where they were the hero, the one person who could see the truth. "I have proof," Emma insisted, reaching into her purse with shaking hands. She pulled out a thick manila folder stuffed with papers. "It's all here. Bank statements, email printouts, recorded conversations. I've been gathering evidence for months." Marcus accepted the folder, planning to glance through it briefly before having it stored with her personal effects. As he flipped through the first few pages, he expected to see the disjointed ramblings of someone in the grip of mental illness. Instead, he found meticulously organized financial documents, highlighted spreadsheets, and what appeared to be legitimate bank records. His expertise was in emergency medicine, not forensic accounting, but even to his untrained eye, the numbers Emma had circled looked suspicious. Large transfers to offshore accounts, invoices for services that didn't seem to exist, payroll irregularities that seemed too complex to be the product of a delusional mind. "Emma, where did you get these documents?" he asked, his tone more serious now. "I told you I work there." "Worked there?" "They fired me yesterday when I started asking too many questions. Said I was creating a hostile work environment by being paranoid and disruptive." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very small and young. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe I'm seeing things that aren't there." Marcus studied her face carefully. The doubt in her voice, the way she questioned her own perceptions, didn't fit the profile of someone experiencing paranoid delusions. People in the grip of psychosis were typically convinced of their beliefs, not questioning them. And the documents in his hands looked disturbingly real. "Emma, have you shown these to anyone else? The police, maybe, or a lawyer?" She shook her head. Who would believe me? I'm nobody. Just a filing clerk who's too scared to speak up in meetings, and now I'm in a psychiatric hospital, which pretty much destroys any credibility I might have had. As the night progressed, Marcus found himself in an unusual situation. His medical training told him that Emma was exhibiting clear signs of a mental health crisis. The sleeplessness, the paranoid thinking, the social isolation all pointed to someone who needed psychiatric intervention. But the evidence she'd presented, the careful documentation and the logical way she explained the connections between seemingly unrelated financial transactions, suggested something else entirely. He made the decision to admit her for observation, partly for her own safety and partly to buy time to figure out what was really going on. As he filled out the admission paperwork, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The shy girl who sat quietly in the corner, dismissed by her coworkers and written off by her roommate, might be the only person who had noticed that something was very wrong at one of Seattle's most successful tech companies. What Marcus didn't know was that while he was documenting Emma's symptoms and planning her treatment, across town, FBI agents were already investigating the very company she'd been talking about, and the evidence Emma had compiled in her manila folder would soon become the key to unraveling one of the largest corporate fraud cases in the state's history. 3 days into Emma's stay at the psychiatric ward, Dr. Marcus Chen found himself doing something he'd never done before in his 15 years of practice. He was fact-checking a patient's delusions. It started innocently enough when he decided to look up TechFlow Industries, the company Emma claimed to work for, just to satisfy his own curiosity. The company was real. Very real. Founded 8 years ago by James Harrison, it had grown from a small startup to a multi-million-dollar enterprise specializing in financial software for small businesses. Harrison, a charismatic 35-year-old, was frequently featured in business magazines as one of Seattle's most promising young entrepreneurs. Marcus found himself scrolling through news articles about TechFlow during his lunch break, telling himself it was just professional thoroughness. Emma had been calm and lucid for the past 2 days, participating in group therapy sessions and taking her medication without complaint. But she still insisted her evidence was real, and something about her quiet certainty was starting to get under his skin. That afternoon, he decided to take a more direct approach. Emma, I've been thinking about what you told me, about your work at TechFlow Industries. Can you tell me more about your job there? Emma looked up from the book she'd been reading, a technical manual on accounting principles that she'd requested from the hospital library. I was a junior analyst in the accounting department, mostly data entry and filing, but I have a good head for numbers. Always have. My supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, said I caught more discrepancies than anyone else in the department. What kind of discrepancies? Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from her. Small things at first. Invoice numbers that didn't match up, payments to vendors I couldn't find in our system, expense reports that seemed inflated. Emma's voice grew stronger as she talked about her work. I started keeping track of them in my own spreadsheet. I thought maybe it was just sloppy bookkeeping, but the pattern became too obvious to ignore. Marcus pulled out a notepad. What pattern? The money was always moving in the same direction. Out of the company and into accounts I couldn't trace. Mr. Harrison had signing authority on all of them, but he claimed they were for business development and expansion projects that never seemed to materialize. As Emma spoke, Marcus found himself taking detailed notes. Her description of financial irregularities was coherent and specific, lacking the rambling quality typical of delusional thinking. She spoke about accounting principles and audit trails with the precision of someone who genuinely understood the subject. I tried to bring it to Mrs. Patterson's attention, Emma continued, but she said I was overstepping my bounds, that it wasn't my job to question executive decisions, but the numbers kept adding up wrong. Over the course of 6 months, I tracked nearly $2 million in suspicious transactions. $2 million. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. That was far too specific and substantial to be a fantasy. That evening, Marcus did something that probably violated several hospital policies. He called his brother-in-law, David Kim, who worked as a financial crimes investigator for the FBI's Seattle field office. David had helped him understand financial fraud cases before when patients came in, claiming to be victims of elaborate scams. David, I need to run something by you off the record. It's about a patient of mine. You know I can't get involved in patient confidentiality issues, Marcus. Just listen for a minute. I have a patient who claims to have discovered a major embezzlement scheme at her workplace. She has documentation, bank records, what looks like legitimate evidence, but she's also displaying symptoms that suggest possible mental illness. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What's the company? Techflow Industries. Ever heard of it? The silence that followed was longer this time. Marcus, I can't discuss ongoing investigations, but I will say this. If your patient has legitimate evidence of financial crimes, she needs to speak with law enforcement immediately, and she needs to be very careful. Careful of what? People who uncover major fraud schemes sometimes find themselves in dangerous situations, especially if they're perceived as threats to powerful people. After hanging up, Marcus stared at Emma's file for a long time. The symptoms were real. The insomnia, the anxiety, the paranoid thoughts. But what if they weren't symptoms of mental illness? What if they were the natural response of someone who had stumbled onto something dangerous and didn't know who to trust? The next morning he found Emma in the common room, working on a crossword puzzle with the same methodical precision she seemed to apply to everything else. She looked up when he approached, and he was struck again by the intelligence in her eyes. Emma, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe you're mentally ill? She set down her pen and considered the question seriously. I know I haven't been sleeping well. I know I've been anxious and scared. Sometimes I wonder if I'm losing my mind because the alternative is too frightening to consider. What alternative? That I'm right. That James Harrison has been stealing money from his own company for months, maybe years. That he's been using shell companies and fake invoices to hide the theft. And that I'm the only person who noticed because I'm the one who processes all the paperwork nobody else wants to deal with. Marcus leaned forward. If you're right, if all of this is real, what do you think happened to make you end up here? Emma's laugh was bitter. I think someone wanted me out of the way. And what better way to discredit a potential whistleblower than to have her committed to a psychiatric hospital? Who's going to believe the crazy girl who sees conspiracies everywhere? As Marcus looked at this quiet, intelligent young woman who spoke with such clarity about complex financial crimes, he realized he was facing a dilemma that wasn't covered in any medical textbook. Was Emma Rodriguez a patient suffering from paranoid delusions who needed psychiatric treatment? Or was she a whistleblower who had been systematically discredited and silenced, and whose life might be in danger? The answer would determine not only her treatment plan, but possibly her survival. And somewhere across town, James Harrison was getting ready for another day at the office, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around him. James Harrison sat in his corner office on the 40th floor of the Columbia Center, Seattle's tallest skyscraper, reviewing the quarterly reports that would be presented to the board of directors next week. Techflow Industries had exceeded all projected earnings for the third consecutive quarter, a success story that had earned him recognition as one of the city's most innovative business leaders. The success, however, came with a price that only James knew about. Hidden beneath the impressive profit margins and growth statistics was a complex web of financial manipulation that had started small but had grown into something that kept him awake at night. It had begun 3 years ago during a cash flow crisis that threatened to bankrupt the company. A delayed payment from a major client had left Techflow unable to meet payroll, and James had faced the devastating prospect of laying off half his workforce. In desperation, he had borrowed from the company's reserve accounts, telling himself it was a temporary measure. The loan to himself had worked. Techflow had survived the crisis and even thrived. But James had never repaid the money. Instead, he had gotten better at hiding the discrepancies, creating fake vendor accounts and inflated expense reports to cover the missing funds. What started as a desperate attempt to save his company had evolved into systematic embezzlement. The irony wasn't lost on him. Techflow's primary business was developing software to help small businesses manage their finances more effectively. James Harrison, the face of financial integrity and business innovation, had become exactly the kind of fraudster his company's products were designed to detect. For 2 years, the scheme had worked flawlessly. James had a trusted inner circle of executives who either looked the other way or were too focused on their own departmental responsibilities to notice the bigger picture. The accounting staff was large enough that no single person saw all the financial data, and James made sure to rotate assignments frequently to prevent anyone from getting too familiar with the company's complete financial structure. Then, Emma Rodriguez had been hired, James remembered, the day she'd started work. A quiet young woman with an impressive resume in accounting and data analysis. She'd been recommended by Mrs. Patterson, the accounting supervisor, who had praised Emma's attention to detail and work ethic. At first, James had been pleased to have such a dedicated employee. Emma's problem, from James's perspective, was that she was too good at her job. While other employees processed invoices and expense reports routinely, Emma actually read them. She noticed patterns that others missed, asked questions that others didn't think to ask, and had an uncanny ability to spot discrepancies in financial data. The first warning sign came 6 months after Emma's hiring. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned casually that Emma had found several invoicing errors and had suggested improvements to the company's financial tracking systems. James had smiled and praised Emma's initiative, but privately he'd felt the first stirrings of alarm. Over the following months, Emma's questions had become more pointed. She'd started asking about specific vendor relationships, questioning expense reports that seemed inflated, and requesting access to bank records to verify transactions. Each inquiry had been professionally presented and seemingly innocent, but James recognized the threat they represented. The turning point came when Emma requested a meeting with him directly. She'd prepared a presentation about financial irregularities she'd discovered, and wanted to discuss her findings with senior management. James had agreed to the meeting while privately panicking about what she might have uncovered. The presentation had been devastating. Emma had connected transactions across multiple accounts, identified patterns in the fraudulent invoices, and even traced some of the missing money to accounts that James thought were completely hidden. Her analysis was thorough, professional, and damning. James had listened to her presentation with growing horror, maintaining an expression of concerned interest while his mind raced through possible responses. When Emma finished, he'd thanked her for her diligence and promised to investigate her findings immediately. Instead, he'd spent the next week orchestrating her downfall. James had started subtly, mentioning to Mrs. Patterson that Emma seemed overly anxious about routine business operations. He'd suggested that her intense focus on potential problems might be a sign of workplace stress or personal issues. He'd encouraged other employees to report any unusual behavior from Emma, framing his request as concern for her well-being. The campaign had been insidiously effective. Emma's natural shyness and tendency to work alone had made her an easy target. Co-workers who barely knew her were suddenly noticing that she seemed paranoid and obsessive. Her careful documentation of financial irregularities was reframed as compulsive behavior, and her attempts to discuss her findings were characterized as disruptive conspiracy theories. James had escalated the situation by scheduling a performance review where he'd expressed concern about Emma's increasingly erratic behavior and her tendency to make unfounded accusations against the company. He'd documented these concerns in her personnel file and had suggested that she might benefit from professional counseling. The final step had been surprisingly easy. James had arranged for Emma to be terminated on grounds of creating a hostile work environment and making false and defamatory statements about the company's financial practices. He'd even gone so far as to suggest to her roommate, whom he'd contacted as an emergency contact, that Emma might need psychiatric help. Now sitting in his luxurious office, James felt a mixture of relief and guilt about Emma's situation. He'd heard through mutual connections that she'd been hospitalized, apparently suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. Part of him felt terrible about his role in her deteriorating mental state, but a larger part felt relieved that the immediate threat to his carefully constructed fraud had been eliminated. James returned his attention to the quarterly reports, making final adjustments to the numbers that would be presented to the board. TechFlow Industries continued to look like a tremendous success story, and James Harrison remained the brilliant young CEO who had built something remarkable from nothing. What James didn't know was that Emma had been far more thorough in her documentation than he'd realized. Before her termination, she had copied crucial financial records and stored them in multiple secure locations. And while he'd successfully discredited her in the short term, her evidence was about to find its way to people who were trained to recognize the difference between mental illness and legitimate whistleblowing. The phone on James's desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. His secretary informed him that there were some people from the FBI in the lobby who wanted to speak with him about TechFlow's financial practices. James felt his stomach drop as he realized that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse, and the shy girl he'd tried to silence had already set the wheels of justice in motion. Special Agent David Kim had been investigating white-collar crime for 12 years, but he'd never encountered a case quite like this one. The call from his brother-in-law Marcus had planted the seed, but it was Emma Rodriguez's meticulously documented evidence that had convinced him this was more than just another delusional patient seeing conspiracies where none existed. The manila folder Emma had compiled was a prosecutor's dream. Bank statements, invoice copies, email printouts, recorded conversations, and spreadsheets that tracked suspicious transactions over a period of 8 months. What impressed David most wasn't just the thoroughness of her documentation, but the sophisticated understanding of financial fraud techniques that her analysis demonstrated. Emma had identified classic embezzlement patterns that many trained investigators would have missed. She'd connected shell companies to fake vendor accounts, traced money through multiple intermediary transactions, and even identified the specific accounting software vulnerabilities that James Harrison had exploited to hide his theft. The challenge for David and his team was that their star witness was currently in a psychiatric hospital, which would make her testimony vulnerable to attack if the case went to trial. Defense attorneys would have a field day with a whistleblower who'd been diagnosed with paranoid delusions, regardless of how accurate her accusations proved to be. David's first step was to verify Emma's findings independently. Working with forensic accountants from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, his team obtained search warrants for TechFlow Industries' financial records. What they found confirmed every allegation Emma had made and revealed the scope of Harrison's fraud was even larger than she'd suspected. Over the course of 3 years, James Harrison had embezzled nearly $4 million from his own company. He'd used sophisticated techniques to hide the theft, creating fake vendor accounts, inflating expense reports, and manipulating the accounting software to hide discrepancies in the books. The fraud was so well concealed that it had gone undetected by the company's external auditors and board of directors. Meanwhile, Dr. Marcus Chen was struggling with his own ethical dilemma at the hospital. Emma's psychiatric symptoms had improved dramatically with treatment, but he was beginning to suspect that her anxiety and paranoid thoughts had been situational rather than pathological. She was sleeping better, participating actively in therapy sessions, and demonstrating clear, logical thinking in all her interactions with staff and other patients. The breakthrough came when Marcus decided to conduct a more thorough review of Emma's admission circumstances. He contacted her former roommate, Sarah Chen, who had brought Emma to the hospital after 3 days of concerning behavior. "I got a call from someone at Emma's work," Sarah explained during a phone conversation with Marcus. "They said Emma had been fired for making false accusations, and that she might be having some kind of mental breakdown. The person suggested she might need psychiatric help." Marcus felt his blood pressure rise. "Who exactly called you?" "I think it was her boss or maybe someone from Human Resources. They seemed really concerned about her, said she'd been acting paranoid and making up stories about financial problems at the company." When I got home that night, Emma was sitting in the dark, crying and talking about how nobody would believe her because she was crazy. The picture was becoming clearer. Emma hadn't had a spontaneous mental health crisis. She'd been systematically gaslighted by people who wanted to discredit her before she could expose their crimes. The symptoms Marcus had initially interpreted as paranoid delusions were actually the natural response of someone who'd discovered a massive fraud and then been told she was imagining things. Marcus made the decision to contact Agent David Kim directly, despite the potential complications with patient confidentiality. Emma's safety and well-being were at stake, and he was beginning to suspect she might be in more danger than anyone had realized. "Agent Kim, this is Dr. Marcus Chen at Seattle General. I believe I have information relevant to your TechFlow Industries investigation. Dr. Chen, I appreciate your call, but I need to be careful about patient confidentiality issues. I understand, but I think Emma Rodriguez may have been deliberately discredited to prevent her from reporting financial crimes. What I initially diagnosed as paranoid delusions may actually be the psychological trauma of someone who discovered a major fraud and then was systematically gaslighted." David was quiet for a moment. "Doctor, I need to ask you something directly. In your professional opinion, is Emma Rodriguez competent to testify as a witness in a federal criminal case? Marcus considered the question carefully. Over the past week, he'd observed Emma's behavior closely, looking for signs of delusional thinking or impaired judgment. Instead, he'd seen an intelligent young woman who was methodical, logical, and remarkably resilient despite everything she'd been through. Agent Kim, I believe Emma Rodriguez is one of the most competent witnesses you could hope to have. Her analysis of the financial fraud is sophisticated and accurate. Her documentation is thorough and well organized, and her memory for details is exceptional. The psychological symptoms that brought her here appear to be the result of situational stress and deliberate manipulation, not underlying mental illness. That afternoon, David Kim and his partner, Agent Sarah Martinez, arrived at the hospital to interview Emma. Marcus had prepared her for the meeting, explaining that federal investigators were taking her allegations seriously and wanted to discuss her evidence. Emma met the agents in a conference room, wearing the simple clothes Marcus had helped her retrieve from her apartment. She was nervous but composed, and her presentation of the evidence was clear and professional. Miss Rodriguez, we've reviewed the documents you compiled, and we've conducted our own investigation based on your findings, David said. I want you to know that everything you discovered was accurate. James Harrison has been embezzling money from TechFlow Industries for 3 years. Emma's reaction surprised both agents. Instead of vindication or relief, she looked sad. I actually hoped I was wrong. I liked working there. I respected Mr. Harrison before all this happened. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Agent Martinez leaned forward. Miss Rodriguez, you didn't hurt anyone. You uncovered a crime and tried to report it through proper channels. What happened to you after that wasn't your fault. Over the next 2 hours, Emma walked the agents through her discovery of the fraud, her attempts to report it internally, and the systematic campaign to discredit her that had followed. Her account was detailed, consistent, and supported by documentation that she'd carefully preserved despite the chaos of her termination and hospitalization. As the interview concluded, David realized he was looking at something rare in federal law. Enforcement, a whistleblower whose evidence was so comprehensive and well documented that it could probably convict the perpetrator without additional witnesses or testimony. Emma Rodriguez, the shy girl who'd been dismissed and discredited, had single-handedly uncovered and documented one of the most sophisticated embezzlement schemes his unit had ever investigated. The irony wasn't lost on him. James Harrison's attempt to silence Emma by having her branded as mentally ill had actually preserved the evidence of his crimes in a safe location, while giving investigators time to build an airtight case against him. In trying to destroy his accuser, Harrison had inadvertently ensured his own downfall. The arrest of James Harrison made front-page news in Seattle's business section, sending shockwaves through the local tech community. TechFlow Industries, once celebrated as a success story of innovation and growth, was suddenly the center of a federal fraud investigation that would become one of the largest white-collar crime cases in Washington state history. Emma Rodriguez watched the news coverage from her hospital room, feeling a complex mixture of emotions she struggled to process. The vindication she'd expected to feel was overshadowed by sadness for the employees who would lose their jobs and the investors who had trusted Harrison with their money. The shy girl who had never wanted attention found herself at the center of a media storm she wasn't prepared to handle. Dr. Marcus Chen had recommended that Emma remain in the hospital for a few more days, not because of mental health concerns, but because of the media circus surrounding the case. Reporters had somehow discovered her identity and were camped outside her apartment building, hoping for an interview with the whistleblower who had brought down a prominent CEO. How are you handling all of this? Marcus asked during one of their final counseling sessions. Emma looked out the window at the city skyline, where TechFlow's corporate headquarters was visible in the distance. I keep thinking about my co-workers, Mrs. Patterson, who gave me a chance when I needed a job. The other analysts who were just trying to do their work and pay their bills. They didn't deserve this. Emma, you didn't cause this. Harrison's choices caused this. You just brought the truth to light. She turned back to face him, and Marcus was struck by how much stronger she seemed than when she'd first arrived. The anxiety and paranoid thoughts that had initially brought her to his attention had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve and moral clarity that impressed everyone who worked with her. Dr. Chen, I want to ask you something. When I first came here, did you think I was crazy? Marcus chose his words carefully. I thought you were exhibiting symptoms that suggested possible mental illness, but I also thought there was something different about your case from the beginning. The way you presented your evidence, the logical consistency of your concerns, the fact that you questioned your own perceptions rather than being absolutely certain of them. Those aren't typical characteristics of delusional thinking. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I was starting to believe I might be losing my mind. When everyone around you tells you that what you're seeing isn't real, when people you trust suggest you need psychiatric help, it becomes easy to doubt yourself. I think that was the point. The psychological manipulation Emma had endured was something Marcus would remember for the rest of his career. The deliberate campaign to make her question her own perceptions and judgment was a textbook example of gaslighting, a form of psychological abuse that could be devastating even to mentally healthy individuals. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation was uncovering the full scope of Harrison's crimes. Agent David Kim's team had expanded their inquiry beyond TechFlow Industries to examine Harrison's personal finances and business relationships. What they found suggested that the embezzlement was just one part of a larger pattern of financial misconduct. Harrison had used the stolen money to fund a lavish lifestyle that included expensive cars, luxury vacations, and a waterfront home in an exclusive Seattle neighborhood. He'd also invested heavily in other business ventures, using TechFlow's money to diversify his personal portfolio, while his own company struggled with cash flow problems he'd created. More disturbing was the discovery that Emma wasn't Harrison's first victim. The investigation revealed that he'd used similar tactics to silence a previous employee who had asked uncomfortable questions about the company's finances. That employee, a junior accountant named Michael Torres, had been terminated 2 years earlier, after Harrison had raised concerns about his reliability and tendency toward conspiracy thinking. Michael had never taken his concerns to law enforcement, partly because he'd been convinced that his own judgment might be flawed, and partly because he'd been offered a generous severance package in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. The pattern of identifying potential whistleblowers and systematically discrediting them before they could cause problems was a calculated strategy that Harrison had refined over several years. Emma's case was different because she'd been more thorough in her documentation and more persistent in her efforts to report the fraud. Her decision to compile comprehensive evidence before making any accusations had ultimately protected her from Harrison's attempts to discredit her completely. The legal proceedings moved quickly once the FBI completed their investigation. Harrison was charged with multiple federal crimes, including mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The evidence Emma had compiled formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, and her detailed testimony during the grand jury proceedings was described by prosecutors as devastating to Harrison's defense. TechFlow Industries filed for bankruptcy within 6 months of Harrison's arrest, unable to recover from the financial damage caused by years of systematic theft and the loss of investor confidence that followed the fraud's exposure. More than 200 employees lost their jobs, and investors lost millions of dollars in what had appeared to be a promising technology company. Emma struggled with guilt over the consequences of her actions, even though everyone assured her she'd done the right thing. The practical impact of whistleblowing was something she hadn't fully considered when she first began documenting the financial irregularities. Real people were hurt by the company's collapse, even though the alternative, allowing the fraud to continue, would have caused even greater damage eventually. Dr. Marcus Chen helped her work through these complex feelings during their final sessions together. Emma, moral courage isn't about having easy choices. It's about doing the right thing even when the consequences are difficult. You saved TechFlow's investors from losing even more money, and you prevented Harrison from victimizing other companies and employees. As Emma prepared to leave the hospital and face an uncertain future, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. The shy girl who had been afraid to speak up in meetings had become the key witness in a major federal criminal case. The employee who had been dismissed as paranoid and disruptive had been vindicated as a hero who had the courage to expose the truth. But perhaps most importantly, Emma had learned that being quiet and staying in the background didn't mean being powerless. Sometimes the people who observe carefully and document thoroughly are the ones who can make the most significant difference when it matters most. Her attention to detail, Her methodical approach to problem-solving and her moral integrity had combined to create a powerful force for justice, even when she didn't fully realize her own strength. 2 years after James Harrison's conviction and sentencing to 12 years in federal prison, Emma Rodriguez stood in front of a congressional subcommittee in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify about the need for stronger whistleblower protections in corporate America. The shy girl who had once been afraid to speak up in staff meetings was now recognized as one of the most effective corporate fraud investigators in the country. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After leaving the hospital, Emma had struggled to find employment, as many companies were reluctant to hire someone who had become famous for exposing her previous employer's crimes. The stigma of being a whistleblower, combined with the lingering effects of her psychiatric hospitalization, had made her damaged goods in the eyes of many potential employers. The turning point came when Agent David Kim recommended Emma for a position with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit as a civilian consultant. Her unique combination of accounting expertise and investigative instincts made her invaluable in analyzing complex fraud cases. She had a talent for spotting patterns that others missed, and an intuitive understanding of how fraudsters thought and operated. Over the past 18 months, Emma had helped the FBI uncover fraud in 12 different cases, recovering over $30 million in stolen funds and preventing countless additional victims from being exploited. Her work had earned her recognition from the Treasury Department and invitations to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country. Dr. Marcus Chen, who had remained in touch with Emma throughout her recovery and career transition, often marveled at the journey she'd taken from his emergency department to the halls of Congress. The patient he'd initially suspected of, suffering from paranoid delusions, had become one of the most respected voices in corporate fraud prevention. Hardest part about being a whistleblower, Emma told the congressional committee, her voice steady and confident, isn't discovering the fraud or documenting the evidence. It's dealing with the systematic attempts to discredit you and make you doubt your own perceptions. In my case, those attempts included having me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. The revelation caused a stir in the committee room. Emma's psychiatric hospitalization hadn't been widely reported in the media coverage of the TechFlow case, and many of the committee members were hearing about it for the first time. Ms. Rodriguez asked Congressman Michael Walsh, "The committee chairman, are you saying that your hospitalization was part of an attempt to silence you?" "Not directly, sir, but the psychological manipulation I experienced at TechFlow Industries, the constant suggestions that I was paranoid and mentally unstable, created genuine symptoms of anxiety and depression that required treatment. When someone tells you repeatedly that you're crazy for seeing things that are actually happening, it can make you start to believe it yourself." Emma went on to describe the gaslighting techniques that Harrison and his associates had used, and how those techniques were increasingly common in cases where employees discovered corporate wrongdoing. The committee heard testimony about other whistleblowers who had been subjected to similar psychological manipulation, some of whom had been successfully silenced before they could report the crimes they'd discovered. "What we need," Emma concluded, "are legal protections that address not just retaliation against whistleblowers, but the psychological warfare that's often used to discredit them before they can even report wrongdoing. We also need better training for mental health professionals to recognize when someone's symptoms might be the result of workplace abuse rather than underlying mental illness." After her testimony, Emma was approached by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychiatrist who specialized in workplace trauma and had been following Emma's case with professional interest. "Ms. Rodriguez, your experience highlights a significant gap in our understanding of how psychological manipulation can affect mental health," Dr. Mitchell said. "Would you be interested in working with researchers to develop better diagnostic tools for recognizing gaslighting and its effects?" Emma agreed immediately. The idea that her painful experience could be used to help other people in similar situations appealed to her sense of justice and her desire to prevent others from going through what she'd endured. 6 months later, Emma published a research paper with Dr. Mitchell titled "Corporate Gaslighting, Recognizing and Treating the Psychological Effects of Workplace Manipulation." And the paper became required reading in psychology programs and law enforcement training courses across the country. Meanwhile, The TechFlow case had become a cautionary tale taught in business schools and ethics courses. James Harrison's sophisticated fraud scheme and his systematic silencing of potential whistleblowers were studied as examples of how corporate crime could flourish when proper oversight and ethical leadership were absent. Harrison himself had become something of a pariah in federal prison, despised by other inmates for his white-collar crimes and his cowardly attempts to blame his victims for their own victimization. His appeals had been unsuccessful, and he faced the prospect of serving his full 12-year sentence with little hope of early release. Emma often thought about Harrison during quiet moments in her new life. She felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only sadness for the waste of talent and opportunity that his choices represented. The man who had built a successful company and employed hundreds of people had destroyed everything through greed and moral cowardice. On the second anniversary of Harrison's conviction, Emma received an unexpected letter at her FBI office. It was from Mrs. Patterson, her former supervisor at TechFlow Industries, who had found new employment with a nonprofit organization. "Dear Emma," the letter read, "I wanted to write to apologize for not supporting you when you tried to report the financial irregularities you discovered. I was scared of losing my job and convinced myself that you must be mistaken. I know now that I failed you as a supervisor and as a person. Your courage in continuing to pursue the truth, even when everyone around you is telling you that you were wrong, has taught me the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Thank you for saving us all from an even greater disaster." Emma kept the letter in her desk drawer as a reminder that redemption was possible, even in the aftermath of moral failure. Mrs. Patterson's words meant more to her than all the professional recognition and media attention she'd received. As she prepared for another day of analyzing financial records and hunting for patterns that might reveal hidden crimes, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The shy girl who had been dismissed and discredited had found her voice and her purpose. She had learned that quiet observation and careful documentation could be powerful weapons against injustice, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who never expected to be heroes. Dr. Marcus Chen's final assessment had proven prophetic. Emma Rodriguez wasn't just a competent witness. She was a force for justice whose impact would be felt for years to come. The symptoms he had initially seen as signs of mental illness had actually been the birth pangs of moral courage, and the patient he had treated in his emergency department had become living proof that the truth, carefully documented and persistently pursued, would eventually prevail.